I would rather be a prostitute in America than return. Her voice cut through the harbor fog like a blade, quiet, steady, and unbearably honest. Every sound on the Yokohama repatriation pier seemed to stop at once. The distant groan of cargo cranes, the murmur of translators, even the restless shuffle of boots on damp wood. American GIs turned their heads instinctively, not because of the words alone, but because of the pain carried inside them. She stood there, small, exhausted, a Japanese POW wrapped in a thin government-issue coat that never quite kept the wind out. Her hands were trembling, but her eyes were burning with something fiercer than fear. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't bargaining. She was telling the truth in a way that only someone who had run out of places to hide could ever manage. In this place, she continued softly, I am treated as a human being. Not as a vessel. Not as something owned. A corporal, barely more than a boy, felt his throat tighten. A sergeant looked away, pretending to check a clipboard. One older GI who had seen too much in the Pacific, wiped his cheek with the back of his hand and prayed no one noticed. War teaches men to harden. But some words melt through steel. And that morning, on that cold pier, the Americans realized they were witnessing something no briefing, no handbook, no victory ceremony had ever prepared them for. A young woman who would rather face an unknown future among her former enemies than return to the place that once called itself her home. It was a moment veterans later described in letters and reunions, one of those quiet wartime truths that never made it into official histories. Too raw. Too human. Too real. And if you feel the weight of her words, if you want to understand why they shook men who thought they could no longer be shaken, then stay with this story. There are forgotten corners of the war that still matter, still speak, still remind us who we were, and who we tried to be. If you want to hear stories like this, the kind veterans whispered long after the guns went silent, you might want to follow along. There's more here than meets the eye. In her homeland, honor belonged only to men. Long before the war swallowed the Pacific, Japan had been shaped by a strict hierarchy carved into daily life. The Meiji Civil Code held women in a legal cage, naming them dependents of fathers, husbands, or sons. A woman could not own property freely. She could not choose her future. Her worth was measured in obedience, endurance, and silence. The old traditions praised loyalty, but only for men did loyalty become power. For women, it became a weight they carried without relief. It was into this world that she was born, taught early that her voice was something to be lowered, never raised. A woman's voice in those days was no more than a whisper against steel. When the militarists rose to power, turning Japan into a nation built for war, that whisper faded even further. Women were told their duty was to serve the empire by serving men. Their bodies became tools of national purpose. They worked in factories, in fields, in homes stripped bare by rationing. Some were pushed into roles no child could ever dream of, forced to bear children for soldiers, or worse, to offer themselves as instruments of the state's discipline. In wartime Japan, suffering was not an accident. It was an expectation. And for countless women, dignity was something they could not even remember missing. To Americans, even an enemy had a name, a bed, and a dignity. On the other side of the ocean, in the camps run by the United States, an entirely different idea of humanity shaped daily routines. The Americans followed the Geneva Principles with a stubborn kind of pride, insisting that even those who had fought against them deserved food, medical care, and fair treatment. The Red Cross visited often, checking conditions, ensuring that prisoners were accounted for. Guards learned the names of the people they watched over. They offered blankets in winter, clean water in summer, and a sense of order untouched by cruelty. Some prisoners were shocked by the courtesy, unsure whether it was real or a trick. But the Americans understood something simple. The war was a clash of armies, not of human worth. It was within this contrast, one nation building obedience through fear, the other preserving dignity even in victory, that her story took shape. The words she spoke on the dock that morning did not come from nowhere. They were born of a lifetime spent beneath a system that never saw her as whole, and months spent in a place where even as a prisoner she was finally treated as a person. She came into the world already carrying someone else's shame. In the village where she was born, people did not whisper her name, they whispered the circumstances of her birth. Children born without a father's acknowledgement lived under a shadow that never moved with the sun. Her mother worked in silence, enduring the quiet cruelty of neighbors who believed that misfortune was contagious. Some called them unlucky. Others called them unclean. All believed they were less. Rural life offered little protection for women, and even less for women who had no man to speak for them. And in those harsh years before the war, when hunger and suspicion grew side by side, she learned early that the world would not grant her kindness simply because she needed it. Her path was drawn before she ever walked it. Like many girls in those days, she knew the shape her future would take long before she understood what future meant. Arranged marriages loomed like distant storms, silent but inevitable. A girl obeyed her father until she obeyed her husband. That was the rule, carved deeper than any law. Families spoke openly of daughters as burdens to be transferred, responsibilities to be passed on. She tried to imagine a life where her thoughts mattered, where her dreams were not dismissed as childish, but the world around her was built on obedience, not imagination. Even her mother, who loved her in a quiet, fragile way, would remind her that resistance only brought pain. And so she learned to shrink herself, to speak softly, to disappear into the expectations that others had drawn for her. War swallowed the poor first and the voiceless fastest. When the empire called, the villages emptied. Men marched away. Women were pulled into factories or labor units. Entire families were uprooted in the name of duty. She was barely a young woman when officials arrived, collecting names, assigning tasks, deciding who would be sent where. Some women were drafted into labor battalions. Others followed soldiers as coerced attendants. Some were taken under the pretext of patriotic service, only to find themselves trapped in roles they never chose. She was swept into this tide, carried far from the field she knew, pushed into the machinery of war that cared nothing for innocence or choice. Then came the moment the front shattered, when civilians were caught between retreating soldiers and advancing forces. Villages burned. Families scattered. She became one of the countless displaced, wandering through the chaos with nothing but the clothes on her back. Capture came almost quietly. American troops found her among a group of frightened civilians on an island whose name she never remembered. But what she did remember was this: the soldiers did not shout, did not strike, did not treat her as spoils of war. They offered water. They offered safety. And for a girl who had never known dignity in her own homeland, that first taste of kindness felt like a miracle. A woman's worth was counted only in silence and obedience. Long before she became a prisoner, long before she stood trembling on a foreign dock, Japan had already declared what she was meant to be. In the order of things, men held the world, women held whatever pieces were left. Pre-war patriarchy was not merely a custom, it was the spine of society. Women were expected to bear children for the family line, to manage households, to obey every command passed down to them. Reproductive expectations were not choices but duties. If a woman failed to produce sons or showed too much will of her own, she was whispered about, judged, or discarded. To exist as a woman was to accept that your future belonged to others, that your body was pledged long before your heart was ever consulted. For someone like her, already marked by birth, the burden was doubled. Her silence was demanded. Her obedience was enforced. Her dreams were irrelevant. Her body belonged to the nation long before it belonged to herself. The war years intensified everything that was already brutal. Rural communities, stretched thin by labor demands and military pressures, treated women as resources more than individuals. Those without strong family protection, girls like her, fell easily into the hands of men who believed access to a woman was a privilege granted by rank, age, or simple desire. Exploitation was common, often unspoken, and nearly always ignored. Some women were claimed as temporary companions for soldiers, others as forced assistants under the banner of duty. In many places, a girl's value was measured not by her voice or character but by how easily she could be controlled. Her mother had suffered these wounds before her. She inherited them not as stories but as expectations. This was the world she feared returning to, a place where her dignity was negotiable, where her consent was irrelevant, where her survival depended on staying invisible. Home meant chains, not comfort. When the war finally ended and whispers of repatriation reached the camps, many prisoners celebrated. Going home meant reunion, forgiveness, rebuilding. But for her the news struck like a cold blade. She did not imagine warm welcomes or open arms. She imagined interrogation, suspicion, and blame. Women returning from foreign custody were often treated not as survivors but as tainted. Society questioned their purity, their loyalty, even their worth as future wives or mothers. Some were shunned. Some were humiliated. Some were forced into marriages arranged hastily to hide perceived dishonor. She knew the stories. She had heard the testimonies whispered among other women in the camp at night, each voice trembling like a lantern flame in the dark. The Americans, in their steady, uncomplicated kindness, told her repatriation was a step toward rebuilding her life. They could not understand why she flinched at the word, home. They did not know what waited there. They did not know that her homeland could break her more completely than any battlefield ever could. The terror of returning grew heavier with each passing day, until it became the very thing that pushed her to speak on that fog-covered pier, pushed her to choose the unknown over the familiar, dignity over tradition, freedom over the weight of her past. She expected punishment. She found decency. The first days in the American camp felt like someone had slammed the brakes on everything she thought she knew about the world. In her mind, the enemy was supposed to be a beast, cold, ruthless, eager to humiliate anyone wearing the wrong uniform or carrying the wrong blood. She had prepared herself for beatings, for nights dragged out of bed, for a death that would come without reason or name. But when the American soldiers guided her and the other women into the intake area, no one shoved them. No one barked at them. No one treated them like objects. In a long wooden barack, she received a folding cot, something she had never possessed in her entire life. Next to it lay a thin but astonishingly clean blanket. On a small table sat the standard POW ration: rice, canned meat, vegetables, a small square of cake. It felt surreal. Then came the medical team, firm, efficient, but gentle. They cleaned wounds, handed out medicine, and spoke through interpreters with an unexpected calm. Not a single gesture suggested contempt. To her, all of this bordered on the unbelievable. She had been taught that the enemy's only goal was to degrade and destroy. Yet here they acted as though even opponents deserved a basic level of dignity. That afternoon, lying on a cot for the first time in her life, she realized her hands were not shaking. The fear wasn't gone, but it had loosened its grip, strangely, confusingly, because decency was something she had never expected from anyone carrying a rifle. Kindness came in small, ordinary gestures. If the first days were a shock, the following weeks quietly unraveled everything she had believed about the enemy. The American soldiers, those giants she had been warned about, turned out to be men who eased fear with gestures so small they almost escaped notice. They heated extra water for morning washes on cold days. They stepped aside politely when passing the women. They brought dry socks, slivers of soap, hand towels, things trivial to them but earth-shaking to someone who had never been treated as anything other than expendable. What baffled her most was how often they said, "Thank you," even when they were the ones offering help. In her old world, gratitude flowed only downward. Women thanked, men accepted. Yet here, these soldiers thanked her simply for following instructions or placing leftover food in the proper bin. A young soldier once left an apple on the table in front of her without a word. Another time, a military doctor patiently sketched drawings on a scrap of paper to explain that her wound was healing, even though she understood barely half of what he said. These tiny, almost invisible acts were stitching together parts of her sense of self she hadn't realized were broken. Through these ordinary gestures she learned a new lesson, one no one in her homeland had ever bothered to teach. Decency was not optional, it could be given freely, and even an enemy could be treated as human. Sometimes a shared laugh bridged entire oceans. As the days stretched on, the fear and tension that had filled the camp began to give way to moments of fragile connection. In the small, tedious work details, sorting rations, folding blankets, sweeping floors, she occasionally found herself working side by side with the soldiers. At first it was purely functional. Then small jokes emerged. A soldier mispronouncing a Japanese word, her awkward mimicry of his southern accent, a gust of wind scattering a stack of papers. Laughter came, hesitant at first, then more freely, a quiet rebellion against the war that had divided them. Real cases mirrored her own experience. GIs leaving extra blankets for older women, sharing pencils and scraps of paper with children, teaching basic English phrases not to interrogate but simply to communicate. These were not grand gestures, but each one chipped away at the walls of fear and suspicion that had been built over a lifetime. She began to see that even across oceans, across uniforms and ideologies, connection was possible, even natural. If a man who had been told she was an enemy could smile with her, offer a helping hand or share a fleeting moment of joy, then perhaps the gulf between them could be crossed, if only for a brief, human instant. For the first time she felt like her life belonged to her. Concepts like human rights had been abstract words, mentioned in lessons or printed on simple educational pamphlets, almost like fairy tales. Yet each day she lived in the camp became proof that the words were real. The American soldiers did not treat her as property. They did not define her worth by obedience or silence. They offered instruction, care, and respect, not as favors, but as a baseline expectation. In lessons on the rights of individuals, she learned that even prisoners could not be used as tools, coerced into service, or diminished by their circumstances. The recognition that her existence was valid, that she had choices and agency, hit her like a wave she hadn't known she needed. Slowly, a sense of ownership of her own life began to take root, something entirely foreign in a world that had always told her she belonged to someone else. It was not just freedom from abuse or neglect. It was freedom to be herself, even in the shadow of war. Every polite nod, every shared smile, every simple act of decency was a quiet declaration. You are a person and your life matters. For the first time in her young life she could feel it. For the first time she could believe it. The world she had been taught to fear had, in a strange twist, shown her that dignity was not earned, it could be given, and that even in captivity humanity could thrive. A single sheet of paper shattered her fragile peace. It arrived one gray morning, slipped under the door of the camp office with the precise coldness of bureaucratic procedure. Repatriation notice. It listed names, dates, and destinations as if human lives could be reduced to ink on a page. Her name glared back at her, unblinking, unyielding, and in that moment, all the small comfort and trust she had built inside the camp came crashing down. The world she had begun to believe in, the one where she could rest, eat without fear, speak without trembling, was being stripped away with the bureaucratic efficiency of a ledger entry. The officers explained, politely but firmly, that Allied protocols required all prisoners to return to their countries, that her turn had come, that her freedom in this place was only temporary. Nothing could change the date, nothing could alter the order. Her hands shook as she held the paper. She had learned to survive by following rules, by obeying, by minimizing herself, yet now the rule itself threatened to destroy her. She had thought the enemy was behind bars, that danger lived in distant guns and flags, but the enemy now wore the face of her homeland, and the law that called itself justice. I beg you, don't send me back. She fell to her knees in the small, sterile office, the words tasting foreign even as they left her lips. Her voice, once measured and careful, now shook with desperation. The officers looked down at her with trained composure, but the interpreter repeated her plea faithfully, a young woman begging not for clemency but for life as she understood it. There were precedents, they explained, appeals had been filed before, but each was exceptional, each required extraordinary justification. She could only tell the truth. She spoke of the villages she had left behind, of the cruel expectations that awaited her, of the women who had no voice, no choice, no escape. She described families that would judge her, a society that would punish her for circumstances beyond her control, and a culture that treated her not as a person, but as a vessel, a tool, a shadow of service. Her words tumbled rapidly, fueled by months of fear and years of oppression. Some officers shifted uncomfortably. Some scribbled notes. Some simply listened, and in their silence she felt a thread of hope, or at least the possibility that hope was not entirely extinct. She had no way of knowing whether it was enough. She could only plead. I beg you, don't send me back. If you do, I will cease to exist as a human being. And then came the moment she had anticipated, feared, yet could not fully imagine, the speech on the dock. She had been led there, her heart pounding in rhythm with every wave that lapped the pier. American soldiers flanked the line, their boots stamping the wooden boards with quiet order. Civilians and translators watched from the sidelines, unsure what to expect. She inhaled sharply, feeling the fog cling to her skin, the cold cutting through thin clothing. And she spoke, her voice steady and clear, striking with a force that stunned everyone present. I would rather be a prostitute in America than return. The words hung in the air, shocking in their bluntness, raw in their honesty, yet perfectly controlled in delivery. Silence followed, thick and palpable. Some soldiers looked away, tears glimmering behind their eyes. Others, hardened by battle and months of deprivation, stood motionless, a lump in their throats. The statement was not merely a refusal, it was testimony, indictment, and confession rolled into one. She recounted the truth she could not hide, that in Japan women were considered possessions, instruments of duty, stripped of autonomy from the moment of birth, that her mother had endured similar fates, that men, society, and even family had determined her value before she ever understood it herself. The audience, whether Japanese officials, fellow POWs, or American soldiers, understood instantly that her fear of repatriation was grounded in reality, not fantasy. Every gesture she had observed in the camp, the decency, the small kindnesses, the respect, coalesced in this moment as evidence of what it meant to be treated as human. She did not cry. She did not flinch. She simply spoke the truth she had carried for years, and in doing so she reclaimed her agency in a world that had never allowed her a voice. The pier, fogged and cold, became a stage for her declaration of freedom, and in that instant, the men who had thought they knew the measure of courage realized they were witnessing something entirely beyond their expectations. A single woman asserting her humanity against a culture that had never recognized it. The murmurs of the crowd, the quiet intake of breath, the subtle nods, all confirmed what she already knew. She would no longer be silent, she would no longer be a vessel. She had chosen dignity and in doing so, had set an example that would linger long after the fog lifted. Her words rewrote the understanding of an enemy. The echo of her declaration on the fog-laden pier traveled far beyond that single morning. Soldiers who had faced her and countless others in the Pacific found themselves recording, in diaries and letters home, the unsettling truth that humanity could not be boxed by nationality or uniform. They wrote of her courage, of the precision with which she spoke, of the clarity that came from a life forged in oppression yet unbroken in spirit. Even the most hardened GIs, accustomed to the logic of battle and strategy, paused to reflect. For them, an enemy was supposed to be faceless, threatening, devoid of rights. And here was a young woman, standing firm, refusing repatriation not out of defiance alone, but to preserve the dignity that the world had repeatedly denied her. In those moments, they realized that war was not only about territory or victory, it was also about the lives caught in its tides, and the power of a single voice to change perspective. Some battles were fought not with rifles but with empathy. Beyond the immediate shock, her speech became a lens through which soldiers, officers, and civilians alike examined their own understanding of justice and morality. They saw that humanity could be defended even amidst conflict, that the principles of decency they had long taken for granted were not universal but precious. Her courage illuminated the essence of what American ideals aspired to: respect for life, equality, and individual dignity. It was a lesson in moral imagination, showing that the smallest acts, listening, acknowledging, protecting, were as consequential as any strategic maneuver on a battlefield. In the wake of her words, the camp itself seemed transformed, if only in subtle ways. Gestures of kindness were reinforced, small rules of fairness observed more diligently, and the soldiers carried with them an enduring reminder that empathy was a weapon far stronger than anger, far more lasting than fear. Through her insistence on being seen as human, she not only preserved herself but also reshaped the consciousness of those who once regarded her as the enemy. The story lived on in quiet recollections of men who served. Long after the fog of war had lifted and the camps were dismantled, soldiers would speak of her in hushed tones over mess tables, in letters home, and in the diaries they kept tucked away in trunks. They remembered the precise cadence of her voice, the clarity of her defiance, and the unshakable dignity with which she faced a fate that would have crushed most. For them, her words became a living testament, a lesson in the human cost of conflict and the moral responsibility borne by those who hold power over others. Across the barracks, the anecdote circulated as a sort of legend, not exaggerated but revered, shared quietly among troops who had witnessed her courage firsthand and who carried the memory like a secret jewel amid the ordinary hardships of occupation life. Humanity was America's greatest weapon. Beyond the anecdotal reverence, her story crystallized the core values that guided American Reconstruction policy and post-war occupation: fairness, respect, and the recognition of individual rights. Soldiers and officers alike began to see that true strength was not only in arms or strategy, but in the consistent practice of moral integrity. In protecting her dignity, in listening to her plea, and recognizing her autonomy, they reinforced a vision of a nation that measured itself not just by victories, but by the justice it upheld, even toward those it had once considered enemies. The echoes of that morning lingered long after she left the camp, shaping attitudes, influencing policies, and reminding every witness that the truest measure of power was the ability to exercise compassion. Her courage, once a personal act of survival, became a symbol of enduring ethical force, a quiet but undeniable part of America's legacy in a world scarred by war. She vanished into the fog, but her words remained. The ship that carried her away cut through the gray waters with quiet determination, the mist curling around its steel frame as if to hide her from the world she had refused to return to. On deck, she stood with a measured calm, eyes fixed on the receding shore, while soldiers and civilians watched in silence, the memory of her voice echoing louder than any cannon. No flag waved to honor her courage, no announcement marked her passage, yet every heart present carried the imprint of her defiance. In that fleeting moment, she became more than a prisoner or a survivor. She became a symbol of human dignity surviving against the weight of expectation and oppression. Her story would travel quietly, whispered from one veteran to another, recorded in diaries, remembered long after the fog cleared and the war became history. In the end, war reveals who we choose to be. Through the smoke and ruin, through the endless march of orders and violence, it is the small acts, choosing decency over cruelty, compassion over fear, humanity over indifference, that endure. Soldiers, prisoners, and civilians alike remember not the battles they fought, but the moments when someone acted with courage, integrity, and empathy. Her voice, sharp and unwavering, reminded them that even in the darkest times, people have the power to honor each other, to assert dignity, and to shape the moral fabric of a world striving to heal. And in that reflection lies the quiet, enduring lesson of history. Under any circumstance, being humane is America's ultimate interest. History remembers kindness longer than victories. Long after the cannons fell silent and the uniforms were folded away, it is the acts of humanity, the recognition of dignity, that echo through time. In the quiet reflection of post-war reconstruction, American forces and policymakers carried forward the lessons learned not just on battlefields, but in moments like hers, moments where respect, empathy, and moral courage shaped outcomes more lasting than any military triumph. Her story became a quiet beacon, reminding soldiers, civilians, and future generations that the true measure of a nation lies not in how many battles it wins, but in how it treats the vulnerable, the captured, and even those once considered enemies. It is a lesson embedded in the very fabric of post-war American ideals, and one that continues to resonate today. If you found her story as inspiring as we did, consider subscribing to our channel to explore more untold tales from history, where courage, humanity, and resilience illuminate the darkest corners of war. Remember her voice, her defiance, and her dignity, and carry forward the understanding that even in conflict, our choices define us. Under any circumstances, being humane is in America's ultimate interest.